Well, here we go, guys. We're back, and I can't believe it. It's here. The season is coming to a close. Yes, the World Tour season is coming to a close, and if you're a long-time listener, you will know it's time for a little bit of off-season here at Life in the Peloton too. But we couldn't have done it without all the support from our crew over at MAP. It's been awesome working with these guys and girls over the last couple of years, have brought some great new energy to the podcast and the Life in the Peloton family, of course. Remember that amazing Life in the Peloton kit? And I was getting dirty on that FKT, those Equinox rides, and they're opening labs all over the world, as well as keeping the train rolling. It's been really, really cool to be a part of the journey. This year has absolutely flown by, and can you remember we kicked things off with Lucy Bartholomew? We went across to New Zealand, did that crazy trip around the Ride 35. We rode the classics with Lawrence Pithy, got the scoop from Derek G at the Giro. Ben O'Connor gave us that TDF preview, and then we went back into the lab with Andre Lagersh. That was some really cool stuff there. Love talking to Andre. And of course, we did that deep dive and checked out the financial situation in pro cycling. After that, we had that really lovely chat with the Rothwells, the father and son. And of course, just a few weeks ago, we sat down with our favorite here at Life in the Peloton, Mike Woods, and asked him 10 questions. Well, it was going to be hard to top that. And I had to sit back and think, how am I going to send you guys into the off season with something a little bit special? So I thought, all right, what am I going to do? Let's get some warm, familiar voices on. My good old mates from the cycling podcast, Lionel Burney and Daniel Freeb. These guys are the pioneers when it comes to cycling podcasts. They took what we have now, something that we very much take for granted. They took it from a conversation on an iPhone to a full-blown production that we see today in many, many other shows. Well, us included here at Life in the Peloton. I think the biggest difference with these guys, though, is that they're true legends of cycling journalism. They've been there on the ground at the tours, the Grand Tours, for over a decade now. And even before that, they've been covering races like the Tour de France since the 1990s. They have the sort of depth, like the knowledge that you only really get when you've been inside the sport for generations. And their podcast, you can really tell that when you listen to it. Now, guys, you may remember that actually Life in the Peloton was hosted for a couple of years on the cycling podcast, which for me, I remember it really allowed me to take our production to the next level. In this episode, we're going to go through the whole timeline of the cycling podcast from the early days before the boys really even knew each other, right through to today, and what's next, where they're going to go. I feel like we really dig deep into how, the sausage is made per se. Of course, the cycling podcast itself was founded by Lionel, Daniel, and the late and very great Richard Moore, who sadly passed away in 2022. Richard was a real hero of mine, a real innovator when it came to podcasting, and an absolute pillar of the cycling media. His influence can still be felt on the podcast. You really do feel it. And I love hearing Daniel and Lionel's old stories of the total legend. Look, I think this has been a real pleasure to have these guys on, and really to allow them to be asked the questions. And I think a real nice change for them both. Now, look, just before we get into it, into the off season, before we get onto those beers and the parties and everything happening, you know what the off season means? The next big race coming is here in Australia. The Santos Tour Down Under. Yep. I can't believe it. I can't believe we're talking about it. Well, yep, you've heard me chatting away about it the last couple of months, and I'm feeling the rush, actually. Okay, so what makes the Tour Down Under so great? It's the first race. You've been starved for cycling for a few months, and finally it's back. And it's back with the first World Tour race, a race that now counts. And it really does matter. The points are on offer. We've seen it change over the last few years. And the course that Stuart O'Grady has cooked up for this year has got fireworks written all over it. And because of this, they're now expecting to see all 15 women's and all 18 men's World Tour teams on the start line come January. The men are kicking things off with a prologue right through the city that's going to get the vibe really happening from that very first stage. And the atmosphere in Adelaide that time of year is so cool. twice up the corkscrew, 3 times up Wollonga, and then finishing on a really punchy circuit around Stirling over 3,500 metres of climbing. The women tackled their longest edition of the Tour Down Under in history with some new stage starts and also tackling the corkscrew twice as well in the same stage. If you've been to Adelaide for the Tour Down Under, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's brilliant, and this course, you'll definitely want to come back. And if you haven't been before, wow. What are you doing? Get in your car, jump in a plane, hell, ride over like I've done before. It's the best way to wrap up your summer break. The best racing you can see in Australia, the party atmosphere every night, and well, cycling the rest of the time. Come over, as they say, and feel the rush. I'm going to be there. I hope to enjoy a beer with you guys come January. So guys, let's kick back. Let's get into this episode. I bring you guys Lionel Birnie and Daniel Freeb. Here we go. Wow, guys, this is an absolute treat, isn't it? You're on the other side of the mic, and it's not another journo interviewing you. It's a good old-fashioned pro cyclist. G'day, Lionel Birnie, Daniel Freeb. Welcome to Life in the Peloton, guys.
Hi, Mitch.
Pleasure to be here, Mitch. Great to see you again.
Well, I'm going to hit you with a hard question straight up, guys, because this is something I've been wondering. And look, you guys have been around a bit. You know what I'm talking about. Look, the Worlds a couple of weeks ago, the pure dominance of Pog. And look, the dominance of him in general, whether it's the Worlds, whether it's the Tour in general, we've seen this dominance before. Rewind, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago. But now we sort of feel like, well, I feel like anyway, we can sort of trust this now. Years before, we've been burnt before, and before we couldn't. There was a lot of skepticism around about it, and there has been that skepticism. I guess my question is, what's different now? Why do we feel like we can see this dominance now and trust it? And the reason why I ask you guys is that you've been there. You've been through this period of cycling. You've seen it change, evolve over the years, yet it feels different now. What's changed?
Well, Mitch, so yeah, you're right. We have been through this before. Obviously, we went through it with Armstrong. You said that we have seen this before. I don't think we have seen this kind of dominance before. We haven't seen this kind of dominance. We haven't seen the manner of the dominance either. Yesterday, won the European Championship, and obviously in a similar fashion to the way he won the World Championship, and it's almost becoming normalised the way he's winning these races, and we've sort of discussed it, as I'm sure you have ad infinitum on your podcast. And but it is extraordinary. I mean, if you go back, I wrote a book about Eddie Merckx, and if you go back, and I've said this often on the podcast, what happened with Merckx was that he gradually got more conservative. With Pogacar, he's kind of going the other way. His wins are becoming more outrageous and courageous as well. But, as far as the sort of doping or the credibility question is concerned, the context is a sort of composite picture whereby, generally we used to take our cues back then from what else was happening in the landscape of professional cycling. And to put it sort of simply, if guy 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, 13 have in some way been linked to sort of unsavory, dubious practices, doping, then that enabled you to, even if you didn't have any evidence on whether it was Armstrong or someone else, you had a pretty good idea of what the context was and what this world was. And in the complete absence of that over the last few years, and what can those cues be? Well, they can be positive tests, they can be police investigations, they can be rumors, things you hear off the record, they can be the sort of discourse. We go to more, I certainly go to a lot more races than I used to. So I'm sort of, I don't have the number of contacts that you would have because you were a pro rider, so people will be even more candid with you. But I like to think that, I have enough sort of transparent relationships with enough people in the sport, whether it be riders, direct sportifs, for them to be pretty honest. And I'm not privy to, I don't get told by other riders, by riders, team managers, that they're suspicious, generally. That's not generally what I hear. Occasionally you do hear it, but not a lot. So that's another thing that gives you kind of information, allows you to build a picture. I listed a few there. There are others as well, but generally it doesn't smell toxic. It doesn't smell that. But I've always said it. I've said it many times on the podcast. it would take very little to change that. If one guy who finished in the top 5 of the Tour de France this year tested positive, or just suddenly there were revelations about him going to see Dr. Ferrari. Ferrari's back on the scene. Oh, okay, that would completely change my opinion on what I've been seeing for the last few years. Maybe wrongly, but there is a complete absence of that. And, and sometimes there's a bit of there has to be some introspection as well. Is there less of that because we as journalists are not doing the sort of rigorous investigative work that maybe journalists once did? I mean, to be honest, I've always thought that journalists have played a pretty small part, even in the exposing Armstrong. We sort of grabbed the bone that we were fed by the police investigations, positive tests, and we then took it and we could kind of get our teeth around it and we could work with it. But the hard yards, the real game-changing stuff came from police positive tests and so on and so forth. So we do have a role to play, but I think it's fairly marginal.
That's a great lean-in as well, Daniel, there, because you alluded to the journalists sort of, I guess, back then. And Lionel, you were on the ground in 99 at the Tour de France, the start of the Armstrong era. I guess a little bit part of that question, but a little bit more, I want you to sort of take me back inside what it was like behind the scenes in those days, because it's different. I feel like I was lucky enough to come on board with you guys in the most recent Tour de France's in the last 5 years and experience what it is like as a journo behind the scenes and understand a little bit what you were talking about there, Daniel, sort of what you get fed and sniffing around and hearing different rumours and piecing things together. It's quite fun in a way. But I want to rewind back what it was like at the tour, maybe some of that stuff we're talking about there, the dominance, but also just what it was like on the ground in those years, those early years.
Yeah, well, 1999 was my first Tour de France as a journalist. I was working for Cycling Weekly magazine and Cycle Sport magazine, and I was kind of sent for a few days in the middle of the race to write some feature pieces, interview riders, and, just kind of get my feet under the table a little bit. I've been to some smaller races over the first half of the year. The Tour de France was obviously the big one. I was as green as the grass. I mean, I'd done news reporting for local newspapers, and I, covered all manner of things at local newspaper level. I was kind of coming into it as a cycling fan, a sports fan, but off the back of the 1998 Tour de France, which had been completely turned on its head by the Festina affair and all of the fallout from that. I'd been to a press conference in Paris in the June just before the 99 Tour de France, where Jean-Marie Leblanc kind of basically tried to ban individual riders and teams from the Tour de France. Now, a lot of those bans got overturned because there was no mechanism to, just exclude people from the Tour on an ad hoc basis. When I got to the Tour, I was completely unprepared for just the scale and size of the race. I mean, I felt like I'd been dropped into the middle of a city with no map. I didn't know anyone other than my colleague Phil O'Connor, a photographer who I was traveling with, and just the sense of being completely in over my head, really, with trying to cover this event. Like, the first thing you realise when you go to the Tour de France to cover it, especially in those days where we didn't have phones that you could watch the race on, was that most of the day was spent driving completely in the dark about what was happening on the race. We had the race radio, which was telling us the nuts and bolts of what was happening in the race. We had that on in the car, but it doesn't give you a picture of what's happening at all. So really, I felt like the week I was there, I was completely missing the Tour de France. I'd have known more about the race if I'd been at home. Two little things happened on that tour, because there'd already been a sort of doping story surrounding Lance Armstrong with the backdated TUE that he'd had for a corticosteroid. Now, that story had blown up early in the race and was still, the sort of long tail of it was still sort of hanging around the tour, but it had been largely, people had moved on from it. Two things happened, I think, on consecutive days. One was that the Yellow Jersey press conference was going to be taking place in the press room, and I was going to go and sit in on this and ask Lance Armstrong a question or listen to the other questions that were being asked and answered. And I stood outside this door waiting to go in. It was in like a sports hall somewhere, and there was a sign on the wall that said that this was where the press conference was going to be. And I kind of waited outside. This is how kind of new I was to this whole thing. I waited and waited, expecting to be let in or waiting to be let in, you know. And the first I knew about the Lance Armstrong press conference was when he came out in his yellow jersey and just like walked past me. I'd completely missed it. I mean, in my defence, this was my first tour. I was expecting kind of a formality to the tour, and there just wasn't one. It was kind of chaos. You had to know what you were doing from the very start, and I clearly didn't. It takes a while to learn the rhythm of the day as a journalist and all of those things. The other thing was I met David Walsh, who is a journalist that I admired greatly and still do. I'd read his books about Sean Kelly and Stephen Roach and so on. I'd read his reporting. He was kind of one of the sort of big figures of sports journalism, let alone cycling journalism. And I can remember very excitedly saying to him, you know, David, who do you think's going to win the Tour de France? And he said in his very kind of David Walsh way, I'm not interested in who wins, I'm interested in how they win.
Oh.
Now, even then, that answer kind of went over my head a little bit. I was thinking, what does he mean? You know, the way the stages play out. No, the subtext to what David was saying was he was interested in what is the kind of pharmaceutical aspect to the Tour de France 1 year on from Festina. And so my first experience of the tour really was one of trying to get to grips with these myriad competing worlds and interests. And I suppose I very quickly picked up on a culture of suspicion amongst the press, which grew over the next sort of 8-9 years, and a kind of a culture of wariness from the riders in the team bus paddock. And just to touch on what Daniel was saying, maybe we've all gone soft, or we've all got blinkers on these days, but there isn't the same atmosphere amongst the team staff and riders that there was even back then, I don't think. There was a sort of wariness and an arm's lengthness. Now, that was obviously also because I didn't know anybody. And, you know, in any world like the Tour de France team bus parking paddock, there's going to be a sense of, well, I'll talk to people I know and have a relationship, and I won't talk to people I don't know. But I do still remember, certainly over the next couple of years, as there were other sort of doping stories, and especially in 2006, 2007, when Operation Puerto and the whole positive tests in 2007 and police activity on the race, there was a kind of almost a sort of a Berlin Wall between the media and the people in and around the race. And there was sort of quite a lot of work had to be done to sort of break down that barrier. And I guess both sides regain the trust of each other.
It's really interesting you said that, because there's one thing I did notice about the difference. If you talk about the journalists and, you know, the press and the teams, something I didn't know about, obviously, but one thing I have noticed is visually, it feels like the Peloton seems like a much more friendlier space, if that makes sense, in terms of the winners now all congratulating each other as they cross the line and, you know, waiting to shake hands. And if I rewind back to one of the big reasons why I got into cycling and one of the most inspirational tours for me before I knew anything about what was going on was the 2003 Tour de France. And I'm a big Jan Ullrich fan. And, you know, Daniel, you've spent a lot of time researching and writing the book about Jan Ullrich, and Lionel being there on the ground around those times at the Tour de France, both of you knowing so much about this period, that battle between those two. Look, time's passed between those two now, and they're the best of mates now, it seems. But I can't imagine those guys ever shaking hands at the end of the finish. There was also a lot of prickliness between the riders as well, I sort of feel like. I don't know, is that something you sort of can feel the difference now, or is there any difference in between what you noticed between the riders themselves? Because I feel like it was a lot more cagey then. Like no one was sort of like, they all knew they were all, I don't know, everyone was protecting themselves and they had the walls up, whether it was you, the journalist, whether it was other teams. It was really sort of, I've got no idea because I wasn't there, but it just feels different now compared to then.
Yeah, I think the team structures, and we talked about this the other day, Lionel, we were talking about UAE's record this year and how it's probably, it would have been impossible for a team, even a Mappe or a Panasonic, whenever, 30, 40 years ago, to win as many races, because teams didn't used to do 3 programs. And so the organizations are much more bloated, and they used to be sort of centralized around often these very kind of charismatic team managers. Even when I came in, there were probably guys who had been doing it for 30, 40 years thinking, they're not like Peter Post or Loma Driessens. But to me, they seem like big sort of, these kind of truculent Manolo Saiz, Giancarlo Ferretti and whatever. And I think a lot of the the ill-feeling, needle, animosity was kind of stoked by those guys who were always at races, and they were the first director in team cars. I mean, if you look at the staff list for a team like Red Bull now, they have 15 directors sportifs. It's incredible. And that's just become so bloated in the last few years. But it used to be, if you went to a race, inevitably, Manolo Saiz would be in the first team car, Giancarlo Ferretti, Brunel, and so on and so forth. And I think that went for the riders as well. They spent a lot more time together in their, okay, they would do 2 programs, but the tour group for US Postal would be together all the time. And I think that was a much more effective incubator for those kind of rivalries and that sort of needle. They would talk about it, they would obsess over it, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I suppose society has changed as well, parallel to that, and the way people relate to each other has changed as well. But I would agree with you, Mitch. But going back to what Lionel was saying, talking about that, the kind of tense relationship, I always have to sort of pause and try to untangle that from the fact that, as sort of Lionel alluded to, I did my first tour when I was 20 as a journalist, and I was just felt very awkward, for a long time, because you were younger than everyone, you didn't know people, and so it did seem tense. And I can remember, I think I've said this before on the podcast, I remember my first tour just seeing these sort of older Belgian journalists kind of leaning on a car bonnet, chatting, shooting the shit with direct sportifs, and thinking, oh my God, how do you do that? I will never be able to do that. So some of it was simply that. I mean, going into the paddock, I mean, that's a sort of newfangled term, but that area, I mean, it's a bit like,
what was it? What did it used to be called?
Well, I didn't used to have a name. It was just cars parked up, wasn't it? And buses were fairly new. I mean, Lionel and I, there were already team buses when we started, but that was quite a new innovation. But I mean, it's a bit like going into a big sort of house party, isn't it? There are going to be some people, sort of very socially gifted people who can, we've got a young guy that we've been using on the podcast who's joined us this year, Michele Pelacci, young Italian guy. And he has this great gift for just being very comfortable with everyone and being able to talk to everyone. But those people are rare. And journalists on the whole are introverts they certainly have been in the past, because they've generally been writers. So generally, most of us have experienced that, feeling pretty awkward in that world. So, and it's a short step from that awkwardness to a feeling of kind of hostility, animosity. So those things are quite difficult to untangle, I think.
Lionel, you wanted to butt in there. What was on the edge of your tip of your tongue?
I was going to say I'm 50 and I've still not mastered small talk with people I don't know. And I think that's completely true, Daniel. We came to this world through writing, and writing is a very solitary practice. You can sit and think. There's time to think. I'm still not great in the team bus parking with just chit chat. I'm much more comfortable with a longer form conversation with somebody where you can kind of correct your mistakes as you go. You can explore the direction that conversation goes in. And I think you find out a lot more about people that way, but finding out information in the short term requires that gift that Pelacci's got, and Daniel, you've got it as well, and you've certainly honed it in your years working for TV, the skill of being able to ask a question that will elicit some kind of interesting answer, not just somebody saying words. There's quite a jump between just talking to somebody and not gaining anything, whether it's forming a relationship or getting some information about themselves or their team or the race, and actually getting an answer that will give you something that you could then relay to an audience with some degree of accuracy and interest. So it's a constant learning process, and I'm probably not there. And I found it, having missed the Tour de France last year, going back this year, it was almost like I'd missed 5 years. I was sort of going back in, so many new faces. In the space of a year, the turnover, not just of the riders, but of the team staff, and my kind of familiar touchstones had shrunk. There were fewer people to go and say hello to. So it's a kind of a constantly evolving ecosystem of people.
No, I mean, Mitch, one thing, maybe this is going off topic, maybe we'll get to this later, and don't want to just talk about the role of journalists. It's a bit sort of self-regarding maybe, but one key difference I think then, which made things easier then compared to now, is I think journalists were much clearer about what their role was and where they sat in the whole ecosystem. I think my strong impression now, and Lionel said there is a new, fortunately there is a new generation. Maybe it is clear in their minds what they're there for, what role they have to play. But I feel that it's quite confused and confusing now. People don't know if they're content creators. They don't know how they don't know whether they're supposed to have a sort of friendly relationship with riders, whether exactly what they're trying to get out of the relationships. Whereas with us, it was that Berlin Wall that Lionel talked about, at least that was very clear. We knew we were the journalists, they were the riders. Those two sort of factions didn't really coalesce. That it was quite transactional. Whereas now I think we're all sort of confused about where do we sit, particularly with the likes of, to be honest, Mitch, the likes of yourself. I mean, there are a lot of ex-riders who have joined the media and brought a lot of things, but that leaves the old journalists who used to be sort of all hunkered down together, all sort of going for dinner together and sort of seeing yourself as part of that long tradition stretching back decades, almost a century of journalists in the sport, which they've always played a pretty prominent role in this sport, not least because, the big races were founded by newspapers and whatever. So we'd always been very clear about where we sat, and I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Really interesting, because as soon as you started saying that, I was thinking, well, I'm probably the one who is blurring those lines. And maybe it's a really good sort of segue now to, I think in 2012, from what I can understand, Lionel, was the first time I could find any kind of cycling podcasts out there. The Cycle Sport podcast that you did with Ed Pickering, Richard Moore, and that's actually pretty good. The old audio quality, surprisingly, was all right. I had a listen, but there were a few around. You guys weren't the first. The Tan Man was also doing for Cycling Central. ITV also had one with Ned Bolting, Chris Borman. There was a French one as well. There was a Scottish one, Velocast. So look, it was a new media, and I'm not suggesting that was what we're seeing now, but maybe this was sort of the slow transition into what we're sort of getting now. I guess take me back then, Lionel, this 2012 Cycle Sport podcast, the first time, because it contradicts sort of what you guys were just saying then. You guys were sort of, introverts, you don't like sort of being out there, having a chat. Maybe the podcast format was great because you were chatting with your friends, seemingly, but you were putting it out there in the public.
Yeah, I think this is where our dear friend Richard Moore comes into the picture, really, because just to roll back a few more years from that, 2009-10, I think Daniel and Richard and Ellis Bacon, another journalist who worked for Pro Cycling, Cycling News, you guys did a Tour de France podcast, didn't you, in 2009-10? I remember listening to it and thinking, what on earth is this? I mean, it was kind of almost like youth TV and audio at the Tour de France. It wasn't really kind of covering the race. It was kind of covering the experience of the race. I remember you had, was it fold-up bikes that you had one year as well? And that kind of was one of the sort of audio motifs of the podcast coverage. But you've got to bear in mind,
we did races around car parks and stuff, yeah.
You've got to remember in those years, smartphones were not ubiquitous, and downloading and listening to a podcast ate up a lot of data. And so the podcast boom hadn't happened quite yet. Ricky Gervais, British comedian with Stephen Merchant and Carl Pilkington, had kind of coined the term podcast a few years before that, but it really hadn't really gone anywhere because there was a barrier to people being able to listen offline easily. And by 2012, things were evolving a bit more. I think, well, certainly I had a smartphone by that point. And as you say, Ed Pickering hired Richard Moore. And I mean, I was already on a retainer with the magazine, but Ed added Richard and said, can you two guys come with me to cover the Tour de France for Cycle Sport magazine? And Ed couldn't make it over the first weekend. So Richard and I, we knew each other. We'd met at races, we'd chatted, but I wouldn't say we were friends at that point. I was probably being my kind of frosty, introverted best. Sort of, I've got to mix with somebody else that I don't really know very well. But Richard was just such a kind of engaging person. He kind of came into my world and made me feel comfortable that he was in my world. I'd written for the magazine for a number of years. I kind of felt like it was I was a bit proprietorial about it, probably. I was a bit like, oh, well, do we really need another person? Richard, in very quick space of time, half a day, just transformed my way of thinking about how we were going to cover this Tour de France for 3 weeks. And we had a great time on the road. It was my birthday and we were staying in this chateau in the outskirts of Liège, a lovely place. And we'd come back from our day's work and we'd had dinner. And when I got back to my room, Madame, who ran the chateau, had left a bottle of champagne or Prosecco in my room as a happy birthday gift, which was lovely of her. Richard insisted we open it and record a podcast about the Tour de France. Now, I was very keen to open the wine. I was less keen to record the podcast. I didn't feel confident in the medium particularly, but he just went ahead, got his phone out, pressed the record button, and we recorded 25, 30 minutes about the race so far.
Hello everyone, both of you, and welcome to the Cycle Sport podcast. We've had an eventful day today on the tour for all sorts of reasons. We woke up to the news of, we'll cover that in a minute. There was news from America or Holland or London perhaps about suspensions for 5 riders in the tour, which turned out not to be suspensions. Lionel's been bashed on the bonds. He had a traumatic event, a traumatic encounter with a barrier, a peage station, which and a really quite heavy bash to the head.
It was. I mean, you're laughing, but I took a big blow on the head from the barrier at the Autoroute paid booth. It was totally.
Would you like to just talk us through exactly what happened there?
We finished the bottle of bubbles, and at the end, he kind of said, "Well, you can work out how to get that online tomorrow." I was like, "Oh, right." So Richard's literally he's landed at Cycle Sport magazine. He'd written for the magazine on an on-off basis before, but he'd really kind of planted himself in the centre of our dynamic in the space of a couple of days with just an easygoing nature, but a drive and a confidence and just a way to work out people. He'd worked me out. Like he'd worked out a way to kind of sweep me along and overlook my own reluctance. So I got up at about 6 a.m. and started researching how do you get a podcast online, and found SoundCloud, I think it was, uploaded the file, and there we were. That was our first one done. And we did them every 2-3 days. When Ed arrived with us, he became the third person on it. But at that point, had no thoughts that podcasting was really going to be for me. And it wasn't really until later in the year I was publishing and editing a book series called The Cycling Anthology with Ellis Bacon. Both Daniel and Richard have written chapters for it. And I don't know who it was who suggested, why don't we do a podcast to kind of promote the book series? So Daniel and Richard and I ended up in a pub in London. And I think the first episode of that was just talking about our favourite cycling book and referring to what was in the Cycling Anthology. And we just, again, put that online, thought nothing more of it. And it wasn't really until the May or June time of 2013 when both Richard and my freelance work circumstances had changed quite significantly. I'd more or less lost a regular gig with the Sunday Times because David Walsh was coming back to cover the tour for the first time in a number of years. And Richard just said, well, why don't we just do a podcast and let's get Daniel involved? And this was in a sort of the springtime of 2013. I kind of said, yeah, that's a great idea, and sort of did nothing about it while he went off and secured a bit of sponsorship from Sharp, who were a partner of the Garmin team at the time. And suddenly we had a small pot of money. And then a friend of mine, John Mooney, who is part of, and he's the co-owner of a Watford Football Club podcast called From the Rookery End. He was the only person I knew who knew how to actually edit some audio together. And so we got him on board. And then on the eve of the 2013 Tour de France, Daniel, Richard and I met up in a London park, and we sat on the grass and we recorded a Tour de France preview, ad hoc, with no notes, no laptop open. We just Richard holding the phone with the red button pressed and the sound wave going up and down, and we just talked for 40 minutes or so and put it online, and we were away.
Here we are looking forward to the 100th tour, and where better to do so than in the middle of Hyde Park in London. So apologies for the breeze in the background, maybe the odd whirring of a Boris bike going past, but I'm here with Lionel. Hello, Lionel.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel.
Hello, Richard.
I said we would discuss first the soap opera of the Wiggins-Froome, what shall we call it, debacle, shenanigans, Froome and Wiggins gate.
Cold War.
This has been, I suppose, rumbling on since last year's tour, and of course, a couple of weeks ago now, it was confirmed that Bradley Wiggins will not be defending his title. This was announced quite a long way out from the start of the tour. He has a knee injury, but the team has admitted it's a minor knee injury.
And that was it. That was it, up and away with an iPhone. Love it. And like the connection for you two, and it's something that I want to peel back the layers now, because the cycling podcast, it started then in 2013. As you mentioned before, there were other podcasts around. Things weren't, other cycling podcasts as well. But I think the big thing and the big game changer, maybe for you can tell me otherwise, is that you were the first podcast to be ASO accredited. So being on the race with your accreditation, when was that? Was it 2013 you got that, or was it until the following year?
No, 2013 we were all accredited through other media. I was still accredited through Cycle Sport magazine. I think Richard was maybe the Daily Mail. I can't remember. Daniel, would you have been with Pro Cycling at that point? So we all had other work, but in my case, I didn't quite have enough work to sort of cover all of my expenses and also earn some money from being on the road for 3 weeks. So I was sort of jigsawing together a living, really. Richard, to a more successful degree, was doing the same. I think we all had other things going on. We were writing books and various things. So it wasn't like we were, spending our last dollar going to the Tour de France. But there was an element of, I've got to try and make something work here, or I won't be going back in 2014. As it turned out, the opening weekend of that tour in Corsica clashed with the Glastonbury Festival, big music festival here in the UK, and I had a ticket for that. So I went off to Glastonbury and left Daniel and Richard to go to Corsica. And then I came home from Glastonbury on the Monday and flew to Nice on the Tuesday, just in time for the team time trial. And on the flight, I downloaded the episodes to listen to the opening weekend.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously, I could feel the thing, forming. There was a sort of a sense of location already in where they were in Corsica, and there was a huge boat, wasn't there, in the dock, Daniel, and just sort of creating sort of stories and characters out of other people, one of whom, of course, being Ciro Scognamiglio. Now, to my great shame, and I have said this before, at the time I was listening to this on the flight to Nice, I genuinely thought this was Daniel, who is a very good mimic. I thought this was Daniel creating the character of a stereotypical Italian sports journalist. I didn't realise that Ciro was actually... I would have known Ciro to look at, but I didn't put the two together, the name and the face. So I thought Daniel had created a fictional character to feature in our podcast. And I was kind of like holding my forehead thinking, Daniel's broken the podcast before we even got started. But of course, Ciro is larger than life. He's a real person, everybody. And I landed in Nice thinking, this isn't just us sitting static talking about the tour. It can bring in other voices. It can capture, the flavour, the sound, the heat, the smell of the Tour de France.
And Daniel, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the beginning of it, because you mentioned before we started recording, you got different memories of that time, not necessarily negatively, but there's been also on that note as well too. There's also been a lot of characters throughout the podcast too, and I'd be interested to hear. You mentioned Ciro, Francois, who I've got to spend a lot of time with, some great characters that have also helped form the podcast, but in the early days too.
Yeah, the diverging is kind of the prehistory of. It's not so much our points of view diverge or our memories diverge. It's just lost in the fog of time a little bit. The chronology of when we did have. Lionel mentioned these sort of precursors we each did. We sort of dabbled in it, and certainly there's no doubt about it. It started in 2013, and it was pretty organic. I mean, why with Rich? I mean, Lionel's explained there how he sort of came into contact with Rich. I mean, in those years, for sort of 5 or 6 years, I mean, Rich and I just did everything together. We worked together. We used to go to a library every day, and I mean, there's no doubt that one of the reasons why, as well as kind of all the hard work that Rich and Lionel put into it, one of the reasons why it did become something was the moment in time in the UK and with British cycling. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, sometimes Lionel and I, we talk about this, something will spark a memory, and it's given the current context, it's pretty amazing to consider sort of some of the brands and who were involved. And with us, the podcast as well, we were sponsored by Maserati for a couple of, we drove with the Giro d'Italia for 3 years in a Maserati, Jaguar. And at the time, there was a little bit of, wow, is this really, really happening? But it became quite sort of commonplace for that kind of thing to happen. And again, that was partly due to Rich's great personal skills and his ability to sort of sell the podcast. And, but yeah, so, and obviously, Cavendish had become really successful, Wiggins and so on and so forth. So that kind of gave it a bit of a momentum as well. But as far as some of the characters were concerned, I mean, it was pretty organic in the sense that, Chiro was someone as well. Not to the same extent as Rich, of course, but I was very good friends with Chiro, and it seemed very natural to get him on board. And we've been sort of blessed as well. Chiro, I don't think he's ever listened to the podcast. I think he vaguely knows what the podcast is, but you asked him whether he would do it, and it was immediate, and it's been like that ever since. And that's 12, 13 years now. He came to an event in London. We did a live event in a bookshop in London. I don't know how many people were there, 100 people, 200 people. Again, he just completely bought into it without knowing exactly what he was buying into. And there've been, many other examples of that as well. And Lionel talked about it's starting to convey, unbeknownst to us, this wasn't really by design, I don't think. It's starting to convey what our experience was like on the road, and and how sort of international and kind of cosmopolitan and interesting the press room was as well, and the sort of people that we were coming into contact with. And that was one thing, in spite of it being against the backdrop of all this success and sort of explosion of interest in cycling in the UK, it was by design, it was international. It was sort of reflecting, our kind of circle of contacts as well, and reflecting the sport as well. So I think that was quite different about it as well, compared to maybe other output in sort of traditional media at the time, that we tried not to be British centric.
Yeah, I think that first tour, a couple of things stand out for me. When I arrived on the ground in Nice and there was a team time trial, then the next few days were along the south of France, and there was a lot of talk about whether there might be crosswinds. And I can't remember whose idea it was. It might have been something Richard and I had discussed in the car, because that tour, 2013, I think Richard and I travelled together. Daniel, you were with your pro cycling colleagues, and we'd then meet up in the late afternoon, early evening to record the podcast in the vicinity of the press room. Anyway, one day at the start, I went off to the team buses with this idea, which Richard and I had discussed in the car, which was to go and ask somebody from the one of the teams how crosswinds form. Now, we kind of know this. We'd all written articles about, echelons, and, the wind comes from here and it pushes everyone over there. And, the graphic designer would do you an image of the road with arrows on it, and you'd see the formation of the riders. It kind of felt old hat. But I went and asked Andreas Clear, sports director with whatever they were called at the time. Was it Garmin Sharp? It would have been Garmin Sharp. And he gave a very clear, methodical breakdown in spoken word, how an echelon forms, and how everyone kind of feels about it, and it just kind of brought the whole concept to life. And we played that in that night's podcast, just as a sort of 2-3 minute sort of segment. And again, that was another kind of, it was like a light going on in the next room. It kind of showed me, there's a real potential here to get a bit of insight from inside the race. We can ask tactical questions. We can ask, cultural questions, historical questions. We can go and capture these things in and almost like we're going off fishing and we bring back our catch at the end of the day, and we compare what we've got and we put in the best stuff. And the other thing that happened was Dan Martin won a stage in the Pyrenees, and I think that midpoint of the race before you get to the sort of first rest day, certainly from my point of view, I was sort of missing home and morale was dipping, and I was just thinking, the podcast, it kind of there's been a little bit of traction on Twitter, but I was thinking, God, we're doing this every day. I'm not really earning a great deal of money from anything. We're just kind of, I started to feel a bit like I'm just going around France here if I'm not careful. Anyway, Dan Martin won the stage. We did a podcast in wherever that was, Bagnères de Bigorre, somewhere in the Pyrenees, and then it was the rest day. And I remember Rich and I decided to have dinner before we did a long drive up to Bordeaux because the race was resuming up in Brittany. So we had to drive the length of France before the race would resume. And it was like, I think that was what was getting me down a bit. It's like, we've got to drive all the way to the north of France. I don't feel like we're necessarily accomplishing a great deal here. Anyway, we recorded the podcast. We had dinner. Richard designated me the designated driver to drive to Bordeaux while he had half a bottle of wine and enjoyed his dinner. We got to Bordeaux at goodness knows, 1 a.m. We got up in the morning, had to write a feature for a magazine, which paradoxically felt like kind of old media. I was writing about something from the Monday of the previous week. It felt like I was, so far behind. And so I wrote this feature, I sent it, we carried on the way, and as we were driving, I just went on the dashboard of the podcast and looked at the figures, and for the first time the overnight figure had gone to 10,000 listeners, and I was like, whoa, that's actually a kind of a meaningful number. It was a big jump from what we'd had, and it felt like there was that sort of turbocharged things, and we managed to maintain that sort of level of audience, maybe not quite that high, but we were picking people up rather than shedding them. And by the end of the tour, we got to Paris and we signed off and said, well, see you again next year. And by that point, I think we were all getting comments on Twitter, because that was the big thing at the time, saying, can you guys carry on? Can you do a weekly show? And so Richard, again, being the sort of person that he was, he then contacted Sharp and said, look, we need this amount of money to carry on as a weekly show for the rest of the season. How about it? And Sharp said yes. Daniel, who was off to write was it one of the Mark Cavendish books, or it was to write,
help him write.
Help write one of the Mark Cavendish books. Daniel was kind of straight into that project.
Help him with his punctuation, that's all.
Kind of ruled himself out of the, said, I'll resurface after I finish that book, and I had a holiday and stuff. And so, and I was, as I often do, I kind of reacted in a panic and was like, well, we can't possibly do it without Daniel. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Rich was like, look, don't worry, we'll find a way. And so some weeks it was just me and Richard. We got Orla Chenoui on in one of those very early weeks. I think Tom Southern was a guest. We sort of tapped into our contacts in the press room and got people who were close to London, and we would meet up, and we kept it going. And once we kind of kept it going on a weekly basis for a few months, because I really enjoyed it. And I think it's only really since the pandemic, since Daniel moved to first Berlin and then wherever you've moved to now, Daniel, I'm not entirely sure. Richard moved to France during the pandemic. And the thing that we lost at that point was the weekly meetup, the social, the kind of the chat before and after recording, which I think lent quite a lot of energy and excitement to the recording. And I think, that was the crucial thing in those early months, perhaps the first 6 months or a year, which was that we were able to sort of propel ourselves through with this weekly routine of meeting up in London to record the podcast, thinking about what the content would be, especially in that off season when it's like, well, what are we going to talk about when there's no racing?
It's funny, as you mentioned that, we're talking online now, and it's definitely one of the things, much later to the game than you guys, but it was the reason why I got myself into podcasting was that chance to sit down and just literally have a chat and press record. It's that contact. Stuff's progressed so far from those years, and we can do that pretty easily, and it feels pretty natural now. One thing I want to chat about is it's a bit more nuts and bolts, but I think it's quite interesting for a lot of people out there who don't understand it, that you were attracting a lot of people to the podcast, listeners, but also at some point there, the podcast had to take the next step and get more professional, and producers. Tell me about the producers and the guys who edit the podcast. And because from what I understand, chatting to you along the way, they were sort of attracted. They were listeners maybe, and these were guys and girls who were out there with full-time jobs and sort of doing this on the side as well. Tell me a little about the producing side of things and how you attracted them and how that all sort of works.
Yeah, I mean, our first producer, John Mooney, produced every episode for probably a couple of years, I would say. And then over time, people emailed us. One of the first was a guy called Paul Scoynes, who's not with us anymore, but he's not working on the podcast anymore, I mean. He just dropped me a line and said, like, we hadn't ever said, oh, we're recording on an iPhone. He dropped me a line and said, I can tell you're recording on an iPhone. I've got some old equipment that will help your podcast sound better.
It's like, I can tell you're recording on an iPhone. I can tell you're recording on an iPhone because it sounds like crap.
More or less. It was a bit of a backhanded compliment. He said, I really love the show. I love what you're doing, but I can help you make it sound better. He worked for BBC Radio and he had his old Zoom recorder, handheld Zoom recorder. And he didn't live too far from me, so we met for a coffee and some lunch, and he said, look, I'd like to give you my old Zoom recorder, which was kind of battered. It had been around the block a bit, but it was a big step up in terms of audio quality. And then he said, I'm also I'm a presenter, producer, reporter as well, he was. So he said, I can edit some episodes for you. And there were a couple of occasions, I mean, I don't know how he wangled it, but we recorded our very first Friends of the Podcast episode for subscribers, paying subscribers in 2015 in the BBC studio at BBC headquarters in central London. I mean, we went in kind of after office hours and we were sort of...
Was I there?
Yeah, you were there. Yeah, me, you and Richard. Yeah. The one about 10 years of Team Sky. Or sorry, it would have been 5 years of Team Sky because it was 2015. And we sat at a proper studio desk with the big headphones and the mics that are fixed, and it felt like a proper radio production. And even I could tell, this is a real smooth, warm sound compared to our old iPhone sound. Then over the years, Tom Wally, Will Jones, Adam Bowie, there was Alexandra Ady. She was part of our team for a long while before she went on to work, I think, for Spotify. They were all people who came to us and said, I listened to the show, I like it, I'd like to help you. Production wise. Adam Bowie, for example, we actually at one point put out on social media a request for anyone with audio production skills and cycling knowledge who wanted to join the team. And just as a little kind of, we said, just send us a short example of your work that we can tell that you know what you're doing, because we're not audio experts. So we needed a sort of a degree of self-selection. Adam Bowie made a little sort of minute and a half montage of Matt White saying, look, because one of his verbal identifiers is, he says, oh, look, mate, look. And he put together this lovely montage, and it really captured, Matt's personality, but also what the podcast is. And we played that in an episode, and we brought Adam on board as well. And he's been with us several years, and everyone has been with us, probably coming up for 10 years now, I would say. So we've got a real settled, established team of people, and I can't overstate, how much they get us out of trouble with, either badly recorded audio or stuff that needs cutting, or just finessing and smoothing, especially when we're at the Grand Tours and we're working very, very fast and delivering this kind of carrier bag of audio nonsense that then they polish into something coherent.
Have you had any episodes that were unreleasable? The audio was too bad, or you just, fully forgot to press record, or, you've just got that feedback back?
Yeah, that happens. I mean...
It's happened a few times.
Yeah, I would say so. And you always have to, on a Grand Tour, I don't know how many audio files you do record on a Grand Tour. Maybe, I don't know, I guess I would say 500, maybe 1,000. And there's going to be sort of maybe a 1% or 0.5% that's, didn't record or something went wrong, I would say.
I can remember on the Giro in 2019, Daniel, you and I'd just flown home for the weekend to watch Watford play in the FA Cup final on the Saturday. They lost 6-0. I flew back again on the Sunday, and it was a time trial, wasn't it, in San Marino? I think Primož Roglic won in the pouring rain, testing my memory a bit there. And then we had a bit of a drive down to the coast, and we recorded in one of those kind of cafeteria type places that serves kind of deep fried seafood, and it's a bit kind of plastic tablecloth type place, wasn't it? And you'd booked this hotel in the hills that was going to serve us a fantastic dinner. I was kind of running on fumes a bit, having just made a 48-hour trip home and an early flight and a full day on the race, and I had the recording equipment. I'd plugged the mics in. I had it on the wrong settings, and so nothing recorded at all. We recorded an entire 45-minute episode, nothing whatsoever salvageable, and so we had to start again. And Daniel was very good about it. He didn't really rub in the fact that we were going to miss arguably the best dinner of the Giro that night because of my mistake.
How is it re-recording? Because look, being on the road with you and having to think about re-recording again, you lose it all, don't you? You lose that inspiration. You're retelling it, but there could be a positive note. Sometimes you get that reflection. If I had a chance to say that again, I forgot about that moment.
Clutching at straws a bit there. I think it was a pretty. We were having to chivvy ourselves up a bit, weren't we, Daniel, to sort of go through We probably were a bit shorter the second time round, maybe. But no, and the other one that really sticks in my mind, which I know cast a shadow over the cycling podcast for a few days, was whichever Giro it was that Tom Dumoulin ended up winning. And I'd put in a request with his team to have a few minutes with Dumoulin outside the bus. And as you know, Mitch, requests like that, first of all, the team might say no. They might say yes. Once they've said yes, it's not guaranteed until you're actually stood outside the bus talking to the rider. And, Dumoulin was a big figure in that Giro. Getting, a couple of minutes with him is, quite a good thing for the podcast. He talked for 10, 12 minutes about his holidays in Italy, the wines that he liked, where he'd been, all fantastic stuff. Pressed the little recorder to listen back. And again, operator error, nothing had recorded at all, and I was in a pretty bad mood for a few days. And you say you can do it again, but you can't go back to Tom Dumoulin's press officer and say, "Oh, sorry, could Tom do another 15 minutes?"
Yeah, it's bad when it happens on the podcast, but with the podcast, there's always there are potentially two layers of kind of recourse with when you're a written journalist. I mean, it's one of the beauties of written journalism. This is one thing I've learned since I've certainly been working on TV, that with written journalism, you can get the quotes from someone else, unless it's an exclusive interview. And even if it's an exclusive interview, often you'll remember things and you'll do a sort of conservative version of what the quotes were. Again, it doesn't happen very often, but on occasion, I've had to do that as a written journalist. With the podcast, at least you can talk about it. With TV, you can't do anything, and it does happen. It does happen with TV as well. Interview. I did an interview with Christian Prudhomme in the Village Départ a couple of years ago, and you both know what the sound system and the audio environment can be in the Village Départ. Caravan music blaring out, and 15 minutes with Prudhomme, who obviously, he's not just sort of hanging around at the Tour de France waiting to be interviewed. Completely unusable. So, but yeah, it's never great when that happens.
Well, Daniel, Lionel, the evolution of the podcast, and Daniel, you started to work with ITV at the Tour de France. You still stayed involved with the podcast at the Giro and everywhere else, actually. But handing the reins over, I guess, as the podcast, was growing and you saw other opportunities at the Tour de France. What was that like for you? Sort of now seeing something that you birthed and you saw your baby almost, and you not being a part of it, you got to sort of watch it happen and listen. Maybe did you even listen? I'd be interested to hear what that was like for you, because a few years later I came on the podcast, and then seeing you there, I was like, oh, this is a bit strange. This is your thing and I'm on it. It felt weird for me.
Yeah, I mean, that I was so sort of daunted, Mitch, by working for ITV and television that. So we tried for one, I think the first year I did like an audio dispatch of, I don't know whether probably wasn't daily, probably maybe intended to do it daily, sort of, a bit of a monologue that I would kind of phone in, and the guys would use. In theory, I mean, you will appreciate this, Mitch, having seen what the days are like, but in theory, people might look at it and say, well, why can't you just do, record the podcast as well? I mean, practically speaking, it would be very difficult. Also, because the hour after the finish is my busiest time, and then when I'm working for TV, it's the most intense time. And then obviously you working and traveling with a crew, so I can't make them wait while I record a podcast for someone else, for a sort of third party. So there's the practical aspects of it, but really, I was just so sort of nervous about my TV work that it needed absolutely full focus. And fortunately, in those years, we had the good alternative, excellent alternative of Francois and whatever. So, Francois was a value added for the podcast. So it was never a problem. I've never listened during the tour. I think Lionel knows this because, I do listen to some other podcasts, but I'm emotionally consumed with my ITV work, and I just don't want to be sort of jolted in any which way. I mean, it might sound strange, but I guess I'm too close to the cycling podcast for it not to affect me, good or bad. I don't know. The only way I feel like I can get through the Tour de France with my ITV work was just to be completely single-minded and only really focus on that.
No, I completely understand that. I mean, there's times when I found it hard to listen when I've not been on. It's because it does feel emotional. There's a kind of a part of me that is the podcast, and listening to even sometimes like the Giro coverage when I'm not there, there's a sense of missing out. There's a sense of I should be there. Life has kind of made it not really possible to go and be on the ground for 3 weeks at a time, multiple times a year. So that's the choice that I've made, but it doesn't make it any easier to sort of feel a sense of absence, a sense of missing out on the fun or the sharing of the burden to a degree as well. I do remember when Daniel got the offer of the ITV job. That was another moment where I was like, oh, well, that's it now. What are we going to do? We're going to lose Daniel. What can we possibly do to replace him? Richard was a lot calmer about that and said, look, we'll just...
I was also going to say a minute ago, I don't listen during the Tour de France, but I do know that Mitch was excellent.
Good recovery. That first year, I think, was 2015, Daniel, wasn't it? Richard and I went together, just the two of us, and we roped in a third voice, not every day, but some days, and that really helped the development and evolution of the podcast family, if you like, because there was there's the likes of Andy Hood from Velo News, Kaylee Fretz, Matt Bowden, they were both at Velo News at the time, but Seb Piquet, the voice of Radio Tour, who sat in the the most important car in the Tour de France convoy, a very good friend of the podcast, Francois Thomazeau, who Daniel mentioned. And then it was after a year of this kind of rotating guest host that Rich and I had a chat. Why don't we ask Francois to join us? He was kind of winding up a bit with Reuters by that stage. And that really, that gave us a kind of a new sense of being, really, because Francois added so much in terms of his knowledge of France, his knowledge of the Tour, the fact that he would book a restaurant every day. It materially improved our experience of being at the Tour de France. And I can remember sort of smugly kind of strolling into a restaurant that Francois had booked in the afternoon and getting a table, walking past press room colleagues who were kind of hopefully waiting to see if they would also get a table, having not booked, and just feeling like we've kind of unlocked the secret of covering the Tour de France a little bit here with Francois. And of course, he had so much on the mic, as you know, Mitch. And then for really those years, 2017, 18 and 19, and even the lockdown tour, which was weird, a very strange experience, kind of surreal to be there, existing in this sort of half-existing Tour de France world. I suppose that's the era that I remember really fondly. We had a really established format, January to December. We had very strong on-the-ground coverage of the Giro, especially that Daniel led. We made the Vuelta work one way or the other, and the Tour de France kind of looked after itself, and it felt like we'd created something consistent that people enjoyed. Most importantly, it was standing on its own 2 feet. It was actually at the point where, after years really of us kind of subsidising it, either directly or sort of indirectly with lots of kind of free work really for the first few years, we had managed to turn it into a going concern that could stand on its own 2 feet.
What about the legacy of the podcast within the cycling media? What do you think it's actually the cycling podcast has contributed to the media? Because I feel like there is an element of this, and speaking to some of the SBS colleagues, I was surprised that they were listening when I was over there working with you guys. They were listening to the podcast in the morning, and I was thinking, oh, that's strange. They were listening to it, and they were listening for it to take notes, to hear a different angle on the race. Maybe we had a different opinion they could use, or hear an interview, and so on and so forth. And even commentating here in Australia, I will listen to the podcast to get some of those great little insights that you guys get on the ground. So it has really changed the dynamic, and only very new to that side of the world, the dynamic that I consume a race. I watch the race, and then we'll listen to a podcast to get the extra tidbits, the interviews, the rider voice notes that you want to hear. You can hear the emotion in their voice opposed to reading it in a quote. So, what do you think? How do you think the cycling podcast has contributed to the media?
Difficult. You probably ask me tomorrow, Mitch, and I'll give a different answer. But I think, I spoke earlier about this kind of what I see as a sort of confusing kind of interregnum transitional period between what cycling journalism was and didn't really change a whole lot for decades and decades to what it's going to become. We don't really know what it's going to become. I mean, it will exist in some form, I suppose, the way the sport is relayed and conveyed. Maybe it's been a bit of a bridge over troubled water, in the sense that we have the tradition, the kind of pedigree, the education of kind of print journalists and sort of storytelling, I suppose, and we've brought that into a different format from the written word into, we haven't really embraced video yet. Maybe it's something we'll do in the future, but it's pretty obvious that that's the way a lot of the media is going. But with that, some things are lost, and the backgrounds of the young journalists, or whether it's young journalists or former riders that are getting into cycling media now, are quite different from what ours were. And sometimes it feels like we're the sort of last of the Mohicans a little bit, in terms of the world, the world we came from, the education that we've come from. I mean, I don't mean literally education. I mean, education is sort of journalist. But and the magazines, for example, magazines used to play a huge role in the cycling media landscape, and particularly at a time when, and we forget this, but we have talked about it a lot as well, time when if you were from a country, I guess it was similar in Australia, if you were from a country like the UK, there was almost nothing else. I mean, okay, there was a bit of Eurosport coverage that sort of started in the 90s. There was the Tour de France, was kind of highlight shows on terrestrial TV, but the internet didn't exist, and there was nothing else except the magazine. So they were this keyhole into this magic world, and that's where we came from, really. And I think we've brought some of that into a different format. So yeah, we've maybe hopefully we've maybe preserved some of that legacy, as well as sort of introduced and maybe helped to introduce something else, other elements, other aspects of professional cycling that people, the next generation, will take and run with. What is it like to be at a race? The things that Lionel talked about earlier, sort of the smell, the feel, the sound of races, which, maybe in the future they'll be better conveyed by video than what we've done, or different types of audio content. But we've, I don't want to say we've been sort of pioneers or trailblazers in that form, but maybe we've sort of started to give people a taste of what is to come in that respect.
What's your opinion on the I guess the side? Yeah, the format is changing. We're going to audio, but You mentioned it right at the beginning of the episode. The style of reporter, the style of journalist is changing too. Seeing ex-pros in there seemingly easier to do that job, less trained, yet they're able to come in and almost come in and do it, in their way because of this format, because of podcasting. There's no way we could have come in and done a written press without being formally trained, unless we had really good degrees of study or actually naturally gifted in that way. So what's your opinion on that? Is it something that you enjoy seeing, or is it something that sort of maybe ticks you off a bit? You're like, God damn it, we've done our time.
What annoys me is when they write really well. There's been a few examples. When they write better than you do, that really annoys me. But
the thing is, I don't think there's the same media landscape now that there was 20 years ago. The magazines that I referenced earlier, they folded. Pro Cycling, Cycle Sport, the monthly magazines in the UK have folded. Cycling Weekly's still going. Rouleur magazine is not monthly, but that's still going, and they do their jobs very well in the ways that they do them. There isn't the same opportunity for somebody coming in to kind of learn the nuts and bolts of reporting in quite the same way. And I think there's an awful lot more team generated content as well. And I don't think that the audience is necessarily that bothered or concerned or discerning about where they're getting their information, entertainment from. And I think that's where the tricky bit for the podcast, from our point of view, coming from a more formal journalistic background, is that we sometimes get caught with other people's expectations of what we ought to be. And I think the beauty of podcasting is that it can be quite freeform. Over our 2,000 odd episodes, we've got a variety of different styles. We've got roundtable discussions remotely like this. We've got roundtable discussions face-to-face. We've got travel log type pieces. We've got long form interview. We've got I want to, I use the word lightly here, but sort of investigation type pieces where we've tried to sort of layer up journalism. I mean, the way I think about it, from a recent example at the Tour de France, one of our spin-off shows, Kilometre Zero, which is kind of the sort of monthly magazine approach compared to the daily or weekly episode, which is more of a kind of a newspapery type approach, I guess. There's an immediacy to the regular episodes, whether they're released daily at the Grand Tours or weekly through the year, whereas Kilometre Zero is more of a kind of a feature. During the tour, I made a couple that, as it happened, went out kind of one day after the other. One was attempting to get to the heart of this story about the Team Ineos soigneur who had been involved in, or potentially been involved in the anti-doping investigation that centred on Slovenia, all sort of wrapped up with Dave Brailsford's return to the team. And I was asking the team a lot of questions. I had conversations with Brailsford, and I was sort of 15 years of knowledge of what had happened in Team Sky, Team Ineos, and who the characters were, and kind of trying to add that historical context into a sort of multifaceted piece. So that was one piece that I put out. And then the next piece we put out was Graham Willgoss, who Mitch, was travelling with me on the tour this year, Simon Gill, our photographer friend, and me camping out on the top of Mont Ventoux in incredibly windy conditions, which is a kind of a audio slapstick, really. I mean, it's three idiots trying to camp on the windiest mountain in Europe. And the juxtaposition of those two episodes, I think, kind of, it conveys the breadth of coverage that we can do on the podcast. I'm not saying they're the greatest episodes ever and they're the finest things ever made by anyone, but we've got the flexibility, the freedom to pursue things that interest us and to try and show that the world of professional cycling doesn't start at Kilometre Zero and finish on the finish line. There's so much more to it. I think we've always been aware of that, as well as a kind of historical and cultural context, especially when going to the Giro d'Italia with Daniel. I mean, I feel like I'm on whether I'm there for a week or two, I feel like I'm on a journey of discovery myself with Daniel. Whether it's learning about the shapes of pasta or the culture of ice cream, or a particular historical site, or going and knocking on Dr. Michele Ferrari's door to see whether he's in. They're some of the things that we've done over the years that stick in my mind. They bring the podcast to life, and I think they're the things that the listeners kind of can latch onto and enjoy away from just our discussion of the way the race has played out or what's going on in the cycling news.
Did you actually knock on Ferrari's door?
We did. He just went out on his bike, didn't he, for a little training ride? We saw him.
No, is that really him? Well, it's a bloke leaving Michele Ferrari's house on a well, it looked like a Celeste Bianchi bike.
Wow, steady on. We don't want people to draw any conclusions as to who's visiting Dr. Michele Ferrari.
It definitely wasn't anyone in team kit, was it, Lionel?
But do you think that was him?
Right,
Because we could still catch him if we go and get the car.
I'm not sure. I think he was going at a decent old clip there, Lionel. He might be in Rovigo by the time we catch up with him.
Oh, what a shame. I'm sure he'd wanted to chat, meet the cycling podcast.
All dressed in black, wasn't he?
Well, indeed. I mean, this is that's so frustrating. We might have just seen him. We were 75 metres away.
Definitely in his house. Can only have been his address.
Do you think he's going to the start?
Not impossible. No answer, Lionel, at the moment.
Well, he's gone off on his bike to the start of the stage.
Maybe we should get back in the car.
Chi è?
Buongiorno, c'è Michele?
No?
Ah, ho capito.
Chi è, scusi?
Sono un giornalista, stavo qua per il Giro d'Italia, quindi...
No, mi dispiace, non c'è perché è fuori in bicicletta.
Ho capito,
È
va
in
bene.
allenamento. A noi il Giro d'Italia non interessa, grazie.
Ho capito, grazie. Buongiorno.
Would it have been his wife said he wasn't in just now and she didn't know when he'd be back?
Yeah.
Would he have done an interview?
Yeah, I guess. Can I ask you asked us there about, what we made of sort of ex-pros sort of, kind of breaking down that wall. In your opinion, what do we, as written journalists, what do we still have to offer? What does the press as we, have conceived of it and still conceive of it, what do we still have to offer?
I think the knowledge you guys have, it's continually, what you have in the top of your heads, the breadth of knowledge you speak about of the sport is, you don't find many pros, if any pros, to be able to speak about the sport that way. Being there is one thing, but also studying the sport in such depth and the love for it. And being a pro, you love it in a different way. You love the performance side of it. You're so concerned about yourself. There's not many cyclists, especially in this age, that know much about the history of the sport, aside from the big names. And I think that's the thing I love the most. And I'm so much in awe of being with you guys, is when we talk on the podcast. Sometimes I feel like, geez, I don't know anything, But as a listener, it's great to hear that. And you speak about the episodes of the Giro. The cultural stuff is great too, but it's rolling that in, talking about stuff that happened. For me, it doesn't need to be the really old stuff in cycling, but it's the eras that I grew up watching and keep peeling back the layers about names that I know and stories that I haven't heard before and linking them all together. That's that knowledge you only get, I think, from being in the sport at that level for so long, like you guys, for 20, 30 years. You don't get that from reading a couple of books here and there. You've really got to have the passion for it. And I think that's what a journalist and someone of your level provides, that we as has-been, or not has-been, as pretend podcasters coming in, we bring a different side to it. It's not that knowledge. It's more of the connection to the sport as a physical pro.
Yeah. I mean, just one sort of footnote to that. I'm pretty sort of pessimistic about the cycling publishing and people's appetite for reading books, but when I talk about us being the last of a certain generation, I hope we're not the last generation to sort of write books about cycling. But I would say that in terms of accumulating knowledge, writing, there's nothing like working for months, and in my case like years, on a book. It is like doing a sort of PhD on cycling history, because you're not just learning about that particular subject and his particular era or her particular era. You're linking about how that links to all the other eras as well. And that is something that certainly you ask us what we think we offer. Well, I'm kind of aware that not many people do that. not many people spend years studying a particular subject within professional cycling. So that is fortunately one thing that we do still have.
Well, I'm gonna test you on it now. I've got a couple of quick fires before we wrap it up. First cycling hero for both of you. Daniel, who's yours?
Pavel Tonkov, I've said this many times, I think. Just, yeah, Mape were kind of the reason I got into cycling from, sort of tenuous connection with my dad's work. And he rode for Mape, and he was just stoic and sort of icy and looked great on a bike. And I loved Pavel Tonkov.
Lionel?
I think I probably have to say it's a real toss-up between Greg LeMond and Sean Kelly, just because they were the stars of the era when I was getting into cycling, when it was first shown on TV in the UK in 1986. Greg LeMond obviously won the Tour that year. I can still see moments from that race in my mind's eye. Sean Kelly was kind of somebody that I read about more than watched, because weirdly that 1986 Tour he didn't ride because he crashed in the Tour of Switzerland just before. 1987 he crashed out. 1988 he was kind of just past his kind of peak, having won the Vuelta earlier in the year, and then 1989 when he finished in the top 10 and won the green jersey again was kind of like the veteran star recapturing the kind of the glory years, which I'd sort of missed, I suppose. But I read so much about Sean Kelly, David Walsh's biography of him that came out in the 80s, all of the magazine features, and this sort of almost unknowable character, monosyllabic, didn't express himself at all. And as a kid, I went to the Kellogg's Tour of Britain in London, and he was one of the people who signed a casquette that I had, and that kind of left an impression. And then when I did finally sort of meet him, I was completely in awe, and he wasn't exactly talkative, and I was kind of tongue-tied. But then subsequently got to know him pretty well, perhaps as well as you maybe can as somebody sort of doesn't know Sean Kelly, and I helped him write his book, and kind of I guess in cycling terms he'd probably be my sort of mastermind subject. I probably have done the deepest dive on anybody's career, on Sean Kelly's career. So yeah, quite an incredible character, really.
Nice, I like it. All right, you've been on many a races, many a stages. If you can, there'll be many. The best and the worst post-stage meal. Hit me with it. Just hit me with one of them.
On the lockdown tour, there was a real kind of shortage of hotels that were open.
I think it's a shortage of food
in the Alps, because obviously the whole of tourism shut down that summer, didn't it? And the tour took place in sort of late August and September, and we were really struggling to find somewhere. And we ended up staying in this really amazing place near Meribel, and it had I think it had 1 Michelin star. Might be wrong on that. Anyway, we knew it was going to be a good place because when we walked into the dining room, Patrick Lefevre, the boss of the Quick Step team, was at another table, and he did a real kind of double take at us, thinking, what are these clowns doing in here? And I have to say that was a really exceptional meal. It was kind of one of those sort of 7-course tasting meals that you went, all small, delicate, finesse. But it was so kind of, it was so far from the kind of the gristly bistro entrecôte that we often end up with at the Tour de France, that it really sticks in the mind. And I think the worst meal, I once had a gristly entrecôte. I ordered a fillet steak, and it was a gristly entrecôte that had been scored down the middle so it could be folded in half, and then it was disguised in a sort of peppercorn sauce. And oh my word, it was just sinew. And I think I'd much rather have just something. I'd much rather just have like I don't know, the fruits and the salad than in that circumstances. There's been a lot of shockers like that where you think, oh, we might be in luck here. This might be a good place, but you end up being slightly disappointed and end up feeling a little bit kind of ripped off. And that was one of those occasions. I think that was in Nice.
Daniel, does anything stick out for you?
I feel like over the course of it's 25 years now that I've done the tour, and I just feel like my exasperation at sort of French, not so much French cuisine, but just French restaurant, mainly their opening hours, and hospitality or lack of hospitality has just grown exponentially, just compounded over the 25 years. No, the worst meal would undoubtedly have been one where I've showed up at a perfectly reasonable hour, probably, you know, in some cases even before 9 o'clock, and been told that la cuisine est fermée. And I've never stooped to this day, I don't think I've ever stooped to the pizza vending machine. Yeah, I don't think I've ever stooped to that yet, although I know lots of our colleagues have. I feel like the sort of nadir, or the sort of perfect kind of snapshot of where French cuisine is vis-a-vis those pizza vending machines was a stage of the Dauphiné this year. So the mix zone is a fairly new innovation in professional cycling, but it's kind of been a positive development. But the mix zone, for a stage of the Dauphiné this year, we had a pizza vending machine in the mix zone. Yeah, I wasn't tempted even at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the best ones, Mitch, I would have been definitely if we can include the Giro as well. But I'm trying to think. It was probably have been one, and we've had many over the years, or a few over the years certainly, where the restaurant owner was someone significant, or someone that with some kind of connection to professional cycling or some other sport. I went for a meal once, a restaurant called La Bibliothèque in Limoges, and that was owned by Pascal Hervé of the Festina team, the late Pascal Hervé. I think he died a few months ago. Places you go back to are always nice. The last 2 years on the Giro, we've been back to a restaurant owned by Carlo Ancelotti, famous football manager. His best friend from childhood, in Carlo Ancelotti's village, and yeah, that's been fun. But as I say, I don't really have as good a memory for food as Lionel.
I would take the vending machine pizza. They're not that bad over the gristly entrecote every time. But I would agree. You know, Italy is like it's the combination of the simplicity, the quality of ingredients, and just the kind of the hospitality. Really, they're so pleased to feed you. Very rarely do you arrive anywhere and meet any sort of opposition to sitting down and having a meal. I think the Tour suffers a little bit because it's peak holiday season as well. Everywhere's always busy. The Tour de France is in town. You know, everyone's wits have been worn out a little bit by the time, you know, sweaty journalists turn up for dinner at 9:30. It's pushing it. And I think that's why travelling with Francois was such a joy for all those years, because he knew a restaurant in every town, and he would always make sure we had a booking. We never came even close to missing a meal. Whereas Graham and I this year kind of left in the wild to fend for ourselves. We had exactly that experience, Daniel. Wandered into an almost deserted pizzeria in Normandy at sort of 9:15 to be told, no, sorry, we're full. It's like, well, you're not full, are you? There's like 8 empty tables, but they're just completely immovable.
I was surprised La Viscos didn't make that, the very famous restaurant. And the listeners will have to go back and have a listen to hear Lionel talk about that.
I kind of
in an episode.
I've kind of felt like I've mentioned La Viscos so often that people will start thinking it's some kind of product placement. But I mean, it's a wonderful place in the Pyrenees, Mitch. You know, you've been there. But I suppose, having been back again this year,
strategically leave my toilet bag there, so I'd have to go back. But unfortunately, they sent it to me.
You know exactly what you're going to get, and it's always top notch. Whereas the one in Meribel was kind of in the middle of a weird tour where, you know, everything felt like it was closed down and everything was a little bit sorry for itself, and then suddenly we were in this amazing sort of Michelin starred place.
I've got one. You guys have to take one of these each. You can choose your favorite podcast guests you guys have ever done, and the episode you're most proud of. You take the guess.
Maybe recency bias, Mitch, and it's a regular guest. I mean, I really enjoyed working with. I mentioned Michele Pelacci earlier this year. Michele is 27. Maybe some people who are listening will have listened to some of the episodes with him, and he's just an infectious personality, much like Ciro. And I think, you know, Lionel and I have slowly learned a lot of sort of lessons over the last 12 years, 13 years. And, you know, one of them, I suppose, is that to really kind of hold on to those people who bring their personality and are able to convey their personality. You know, whether it's with Michele before he speaks very good English, but before he came on the podcast for the first time, you know, I was conscious that it would be difficult for someone in their second language. And, you know, he's not as experienced as us. He's only been covering cycling for 2 or 3 years. You know, the reason I wanted him on the podcast was because of his personality, that this immediate connection he has with people. And within a couple of days, although I gave him a big bollocking on the first day, actually, when he took 45 minutes for his lunch and we had to get up to the top of it, and I gave him a real dressing down the first day that he was on the Giro. But within 2 days, well, within a day and a half, I was reassured that he was going to connect with the audience in the same way that he connected with me and he connects with everyone else, you know, when I met him a couple of years ago. So as a sort of recurring guest, that's one I would pick out.
Yeah, Lionel, give us the episode you're most proud of.
If I can pick 3 kind of mini-series really, briefly. 2020 lockdown, when obviously all the racing stopped and we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how long things were going to be suspended. And we were acutely aware that we had, we had people that were going to be sitting at home with nothing to do. And I think we felt a lot of self-generated pressure to do something around the Giro d'Italia in that May, you know, that early part of the lockdown. And we thought really hard about that, and to give Daniel the lion's share of the credit for the ideas, the format, but we all contributed in a way to our Giro.
Where are we, Lionel?
We are in Budapest, well, virtual Budapest, at the start of the very first virtual Grand Tour that the Cycling Podcast has ever covered, the 2020 Giro d'Italia.
I've got a question, Napalm. 40 seconds into our virtual, or our Giro, are we in Buda?
Remember the branding, guys. Remember the branding.
Are we in Buda or are we in Pest?
I've got my left foot in Buda and my right foot in Pest. I'm straddling the Danube.
Do you know which is which?
Well, Buda comes first.
Do you know which is which?
Pest comes second.
Well, we're starting our prologue as the actual 2020 Giro's prologue was supposed to start in Pest, which, if you're looking at Budapest, it's the right bank, Rive droite.
I mean, Pest Buda sounds more like a sort of a bothersome spiritual being.
It doesn't work at all, does it?
No.
So listen, what's coming up in Stage 1 from our Giro? We will be with you nightly for the next 3 weeks as we travel around, well, starting off in Hungary and going to Italy. In tonight's first episode, we have interviews with Italian authors and historians, and in fact also Daniel's former professors, John Foote and John Dickey, and also the director of the other Giro d'Italia, Mauro Vegni, and we'll hear from him. We're looking back at the 1946 Giro, the Giro of Rebirth, and ahead, I suppose, to when we get the Giro once again. We'll also have a nightly slot will be Amicor, where we reach into the vaults of the Cycling Podcast and pull out a favourite clip from an episode where we've been at the Giro.
We'll have a wine of the day. A virtual Giro d'Italia.
Two of us will have a wine of the day. I'm not sure if you've got any left. That's the scandal. That's the first scandal.
The route of the 2020 Giro as it was supposed to be. So the first kind of couple of episodes had a Hungarian flavour to them. And then we kind of delved into our memory banks and contacts books, I suppose, to piece together stories that captured the history and the flavour of the Giro. And I mean, we went off on some of the tangents that Daniel introduces so well in the Giro coverage when we were actually there. The one that sticks in my mind is the one about Gianni Bugno leading the Giro from start to finish in 1990, which was also the year that Italy hosted the Football World Cup. And I think that was where, because we weren't there and we had a bit of time to kind of work on these ideas during the day, and we were able to record them all remotely together, it felt like we were putting something together with just a little bit of an ability to pause for breath and really think about what it was we wanted to create over the 3 weeks. And partly because no one had anything else to watch or do, the series went down really, really well with people listening. But I look back on it now and think that was a real high watermark of what we've created when the three of us were all working together. The second one was the Tour de Cos series, which was completely out of the realm of professional cycling. It was my and Simon Gill, our friend, the photographer, we decided during lockdown that we wanted to ride our bikes from every Scottish Football League ground. Anyone who knows Scottish football will know that this would have taken us to all sorts of obscure places like Montrose and Perth and Dundee. I mean, not obscure, but we were travelling all the way around Scotland. We set off for that trip 3 days after Richard died, or 4 days after Richard died, and so for me personally, it was like therapy. Really, it was a way to cope with the enormous shock of losing Richard so suddenly. It felt like at the time the most natural thing to do was just to get on my bike and kind of retreat into my own thoughts. And I fortunately had lots of content that was ready made to drop in, and we went with no expectations. We just went thinking, let's just cycle the first day and see how far we get, and if we get through the first day, let's do the second day.
The Scottish FA Cup fourth round, Brecon City 0, Dundee United 1. Clydebank against Hibernian as a late kick-off. Dundee 1, Meadowbank Thistle 1.
Alloa Athletic, Airdrieonians, Heart of Midlothian, Hamilton Academical, Queen's Park, Queen of the South.
2, St Mirren 3.
These are names I associate with the Saturday tea times of my childhood, when I'd sit down to watch the football results on BBC's Grandstand programme, and the mention of Stenhousemuir and Stirling Albion would conjure up images of what exactly? I really didn't know.
Scottish League Division 1, Clyde 1, Airdrieonians 0. Dumbarton 2, Montrose 1.
They sounded exotic, faraway places, with a touch of romance and mystery that the more familiar English clubs seem to lack.
Scottish League Division 2, Ayr United 2, Alloa 0.
I'm Lionel Burney, and I grew up 2 doors down from Simon Gill.
Hello.
As children, our 2 obsessions were football and then a little later cycling. We played and watched football together, and we'd head into the Hertfordshire lanes on our bikes, pretending we were riding the Tour de France. When the pandemic put life on pause, we talked about what we'd like to do when we could travel again. I said I wanted to do a multi-day bike ride of some sort. Simon said he wanted to visit and photograph every Scottish Football League ground. We looked at a map and realised we could combine the 2 ideas. The Tour de Cos was born, the beautiful game on 2 wheels. There are so many questions to be answered over the course of this series. Will we make it as far as Forfar without falling out? Why are Cowdenbeath called the Blue Brazil? What actually is Iron Brew? And do my ancestors really hail from Burney?
Queen's Park 0, Albion Rovers 0. Stirling Albion 1, East Stirling 0.
And so I was making something that I ended up being incredibly proud of. Again, Tom Wally, our producer, put that together and did a fantastic job in the kind of the post-production. But it's something that tells a story about our combined grief. I know Daniel wasn't on that trip, but he was going through exactly what I was going through in a completely different way, and I felt like it was the fact that I was in Richard's home country, Scotland. All of the kind of the jokes that we'd made at Richard's expense about Scottish sport, they felt like, as I say, it felt like a kind of therapeutic journey, and proof really that cycling or any kind of movement is a way to process, any kind of hurt, deep upset, emotional stress. And finally, Mitch, and I'm not just saying this because working with you on Life in the Peloton when we hosted your podcast on our platform for a couple of years, again, through that lockdown period, your questions that you asked me about our thought processes and what we were making really made me ask myself what it was I was trying to make. And I found that a really interesting and valuable experience, as well as hearing your progress as an interviewer as well. I mean, I'm not saying I'm David Frost or anything, but I do enjoy sitting down to interview people and thinking about the direction it might go in, and then, changing direction if I have to midway. And I could feel you sort of learning in real time as you were making these podcasts. And I really enjoyed that process as well.
Oh, awesome, guys. Well, it leads me to my last question. Where to next? The big one, where are we going to see it going? Have you ever thought about stopping? God forbid. Where to next with the pod, the cycling podcast?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to sort of labour the same point. It's an interesting time, Mitch. I mean, we constantly are asking ourselves questions about not just ourselves, but where the cycling media is going. I think since I have memories of thinking about this subject for the last 20, 25 years with the advent of the internet in particular, and feeling as though the whole of the media is kind of asking itself questions about its future, existential questions. And, that was it was kind of on the horizon when I started and write for magazines and, newspapers and so on, that you sort of knew that there was a seismic change somewhere on the horizon, but it didn't necessarily feel as though it was imminent. And now it feels more imminent than ever. And in addition to that, this is all against the backdrop, I would say, and this maybe goes right back to the first question you asked about Pogačar. The sport feels as though it's living through this kind of golden age, in terms of, the entertainment we're seeing, but also, and maybe it's on a sort of false pedestal at the moment, of the amount of money in it and the amount of interest, the amount of investment. And I do feel as though it's a bubble that could burst to a certain extent. I feel as though too much wealth is being concentrated right at the top of the sport, and if you look at the provenance as well, where that money is coming from, I think there are reasons to be slightly sort of squeamish about some of it. So I feel as though there's a lot of uncertainty, and we're kind of on shifting sands at the moment, and I'm slightly anxious about that, I would say.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, I think the sport is struggling to grapple with the way it has evolved, and particularly the sort of broadcasting of the sport, and the fans who sat down to watch maybe the last couple of hours of the World Championships or the last couple of hours of the European Road Race Championships that Pogačar also won. You sit down to watch the last couple of hours, you've missed the race. Like, the racing has changed, and the broadcasting, TV broadcasting style is, how is it going to adapt to that? And I think that's where I think there's, quite an opportunity in the sort of reflective, but also reflective, with not too much time to kind of, for all of our thoughts and emotions about the sport to sort of go cold. The podcast offers an opportunity to try and analyze and explain and sort of discuss and chew over in a really interesting way, because the sport itself remains nuanced and different, and it's evolving quicker than we can perhaps adjust our minds to. Really, I sometimes feel myself caught thinking about a race as if it's 2013, and that the way that a team is going to win is by putting all 7 riders on the front and riding down Pogačar. Well, we haven't seen that for 5 years, have we? So I think there's always something interesting to say. Mitch, you asked, I don't mind tackling this one, you asked, have you thought about stopping? I must admit, from my point of view, there was a big moment where I did think this is the last Tour de France that I'm going to do.
Mitch, do you mean just this week or generally?
I definitely stood on the Place de la Concorde at the end of the 2023 Tour de France, and thought, I had a look around thinking, I don't think I'll do a full tour again. I needed a year off after the losing Richard and I lost my dad that summer as well, 2022, and then I went to the Tour de France, as you know, Mitch, because you were there with me. And hindsight's a wonderful thing. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time by ploughing on and going to the Tour. I travelled home in the middle of the Tour for my dad's funeral, and I got COVID on the way home. I felt really rotten by the time I got home, and my mum had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and she was about to start her first course of chemotherapy a couple of days after Dad's funeral. And the celebrant said, through the whole of the lockdown period, I've seen too many situations where, not to put too fine a point on it, I've done funerals in quick succession. Don't place your mum in a vulnerable position by standing next to her at the funeral. So I made the very difficult decision to not go, and I watched it on a video link. This has got nothing to do with the cycling podcast, but it's got everything to do with what I was going through in 2022 and 2023, and I just kind of hit the buffers at a certain point and realised I couldn't just keep carrying on to something that was kind of meaning less and less to me as time went on. And, you know, my gratitude to Daniel for keeping the plate spinning throughout 2024, you know, on his own. I mean, I was working and hopefully supporting in the background, but Daniel kept the podcast going single-handedly, really, obviously with all of the help from the guest voices and what have you in 2024. And that enabled me to come back with a renewed kind of sense of enthusiasm this year. But I think we've always been conscious that the change takes time for our audience to get used to and embrace. And so the constant kind of change, as you know, it's been counterproductive at times. And so it's being able to settle back into what we know is we've committed to an established rhythm now, you know, and I think that has enabled us to kind of sort of calmly sort of take stock and just keep putting one foot in front of the other, really.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. And it's been fantastic to sit down with you guys today. And look, from my side of things, it's been great journey to come along with you. And I can say that because, you know, we've been a part of the journey along there, being a listener, being a guest, being even under the umbrella for a while there too. And guys, I know there's a big following and as being experienced it myself, we were trying to count off Lionel and I how many fans of the podcast we'd meet along the way, and I think you outdid me 10-1 at that Tour de France, undoubtedly. And it wasn't about that; it's more about the culture that you create with that, and I think it's something you can connect to. The phenomenon of podcasting, it's something you have in your ear, and you feel like you know the person when you meet them, even though you've never met them. So it's something quite special. So, guys, great to chat with you as always, and always good. It's finally good to hear the story behind how, as you guys said it, the meat and the sausage. How was it? How the sausage is made?
Something like that, Mitch. Yeah, less gristle or more gristle.
Put the gristle in the sausage. There we go. That's what we're looking for. Thanks, guys.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mitch.
Well, guys, what did you think of that? I really, really enjoyed the relaxed atmosphere that it was. To be able to have Lionel and Daniel have the mic turn on them and allow them to just sort of be open and honest. I've heard a lot of cycling podcast episodes and they were saying some stuff that I'd never heard them say before. I hope you guys got a lot out of that and a little bit of an idea of what it takes to create these podcasts that you listen to. A big thanks goes out to our major partner, MAP. Loved working with these guys this year, and this podcast doesn't happen without all their support. Loved having TDU on as well, and I'll be across there to feel the rush, and I have a cheeky cold one with you if I run into you in the streets of Adelaide. This podcast couldn't be done without the help of our producers, Red Bricks Media. A big thanks goes out to Will Jones and, of course, Eleanor Terry as well. Guys, it doesn't happen without you, so I want to hear from you. Send in your messages. Let me know what you're doing in the off-season. And if you're heading down to the Dirty Docker, here we go. Big weekend ahead. Guys, we're going to be having Stu and Harry next week with the Race Radio. We've got the Race Communique the week after. And for the members, the Life in the Peloton Pelo, we've got one last episode with Swano coming after that. So long, so well. Enjoy the off-season. Here we go, guys. Cheers to you all. That iconic music in this episode was composed by none other than the legend, Pete Shelley. Cheers, mate.